Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, originally published in French in 1961 as Folie et Déraison, is a landmark study that reshaped the way we think about madness, reason, and the history of psychiatry. Instead of narrating a triumphal progress of science and humanitarian concern, Foucault tells a different story, one of exclusion, silencing, and the exercise of power. He argues that the way Western societies have defined and treated madness has less to do with medical discovery than with broader cultural frameworks and institutional practices. At its heart, Madness and Civilization asks unsettling questions: what counts as reason, and who decides? Why are certain voices silenced, labeled irrational, or excluded? And how do institutions, whether hospitals, prisons or asylums, reflect deeper structures of power that organize society? To appreciate the depth of Foucault's analysis, we need to examine its philosophical roots, its key historical moments, its central conceptual contributions, and its continuing relevance. Along the way, we must also address the criticisms and debates that his work has generated. Philosophical roots of the project. Foucault's approach to madness was shaped by a series of intellectual influences. First, there is Hegel. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel described madness as a kind of radical estrangement of the self, a point where consciousness collapses into its own negation. Madness was not simply an error, but an extreme moment in the dialectic of spirit. While Hegel ultimately integrated madness back into the rational unfolding of history, Foucault resists this reconciliatory narrative. For him, madness marks not the dialectical other of reason but a disruptive remainder, an element that reason suppresses in order to constitute itself. Second, Nietzsche provided Foucault with a critical method. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche had demonstrated that concepts we take to be eternal truths, such as morality, are in fact contingent products of struggle, conflict, and power. Foucault adapts this genealogical method to show that madness is not a universal fact but a historical construct. It is what societies produce when they draw boundaries between the rational and the irrational. Third, Foucault inherited insights from French history and epistemology, especially from Georges Canguilhem, who emphasized how concepts of health and illness change historically. Likewise, Claude Lévi-Strauss's structuralism highlighted the cultural patterns underlying classifications. Foucault synthesized these insights into what he would later call an archaeology of knowledge, an attempt to excavate the hidden structures shaping how an era thinks. In short, Madness and Civilization sits at the crossroads of philosophy, history, and cultural critique. The Great Confinement. One of Foucault's most arresting claims is that of the Great Confinement. In the 17th century, Western Europe began to establish large institutions, such as the Hôpital Général in Paris, that confined not only the insane but also beggars, vagabonds, and criminals. Foucault emphasizes that these institutions were not primarily medical but moral and economic. He writes, "Confinement is the great administrative and political operation by which the poor are arrested and confined in the name of public order." Foucault, 1961, p. 64. Madness was not separated from poverty, both were seen as forms of idleness, threats to productivity, and dangers to civic life. An example can be seen in the Hôpital Général, which by 1656 housed thousands of inmates. They were not treated medically but subjected to strict labor regimes, discipline, and punishment. The mad were simply absorbed into this system, treated less as patients than as social deviants. This reframing challenges the idea that modern psychiatry emerged out of compassion. Instead, it suggests that the birth of confinement was about controlling bodies and enforcing order. Madness in Renaissance culture. Foucault contrasts this with earlier attitudes toward madness in the Renaissance. Far from being hidden away, madness was a visible and even symbolic presence in art and literature. Erasmus's In Praise of Folly portrayed folly as a satirical truth-teller, exposing the absurdities of society and even of reason itself. Similarly, the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, such as The Ship of Fools, captured madness as part of the human condition, grotesque yet revelatory. The Ship of Fools was not merely a metaphor. Across Europe, records describe vessels that carried the insane and socially deviant from one city to another, both as spectacle and as exile. Here, madness was ambiguous, both feared and respected, both inside and outside reason. It was only with the Enlightenment's insistence on rational order that madness was stripped of this cultural role and reduced to silence. The birth of the asylum. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, madness became a distinct object of medical discourse. Reformers such as Philippe Pinel in France and Samuel Tuke in England are often celebrated as pioneers who liberated the insane from chains and introduced more humane treatments. Pinel's gesture of unchaining patients at the Bicêtre Asylum has become iconic in histories of psychiatry. Foucault, however, complicates this story. While chains may have been removed, new forms of control took their place. Patients were subjected to constant observation, moral instruction, and behavioral correction. The doctor assumed not only medical authority but also moral authority. As Foucault writes, the asylum no longer punished the madman's guilt but organized the world of his judgment, 1961, p. 241. This meant that madness was not merely treated as an illness but as a failure of rational and moral conduct. The medical gaze penetrated the very soul. The rise of the asylum thus illustrates a key Foucauldian theme: progress in humanitarian terms often conceals new techniques of discipline. Madness, truth, and silence. At the conceptual heart of madness and civilization lies the idea that madness is not simply an absence of reason but a form of truth that reason excludes. During the Renaissance, madness could still speak through literature, art, and popular culture. But with the rise of modern psychiatry, this voice was systematically silenced. Foucault writes, "The language of psychiatry, which is a monologue of reason about madness, has been established only on the basis of such a silence," 1961, p. 12. Psychiatry did not discover madness, it constituted it as an object by first excluding the self-expression of the mad. This silence resonates with Foucault's later work on power and knowledge. The categories of normal and pathological are not neutral but are bound up with broader structures of authority. Defining madness is simultaneously an act of producing truth and exercising power. Relevance for contemporary life. Although madness and civilization is a historical study, its implications extend powerfully to contemporary issues. First, the medicalization of behavior remains a pressing concern. The expansion of psychiatric diagnoses, ranging from attention deficit disorder to social anxiety, has led some critics to argue that ordinary human differences are being pathologized. Are we witnessing a new form of confinement, not in physical asylums but in diagnostic labels and pharmaceutical regimes? Second, Foucault's insistence on listening to the silenced resonates with today's mental health movements. Campaigns such as Mad Pride reclaim the identity of the mad as a source of strength and challenge the stigma of mental illness. This is precisely the reversal of silence that Foucault's history reveals. Third, his work forces us to examine the institutions that govern our lives. Schools, hospitals, prisons, and workplaces all employ techniques of observation, classification, and normalization that echo the logic of the asylum. Understanding madness becomes a way of understanding society itself. Critiques of Foucault. Despite its influence, Madness and Civilization has been met with substantial criticism. Historian Andrew Scull, in Madness in Civilization, 2015, argues that Foucault overstated the scale of the Great Confinement. Archival data suggests that numbers were smaller and motives more complex than mere social control. For Scull, Foucault's dramatic narrative risks oversimplifying a varied historical reality. Roy Porter, another leading historian of psychiatry, contended that Foucault overlooked the voices of the mad themselves. By focusing on institutions and discourses, Porter argued, Foucault ironically reproduces the very silencing he described. The lived experience of patients is often absent in his sweeping analysis. Philosopher Jürgen Habermas offered a more fundamental critique. In the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, 1985, Habermas suggested that Foucault's genealogical method undermines its own critical potential. If all truth is bound up with power, then on what basis can Foucault himself criticize domination? Without some normative ground, critique risks collapsing into relativism. These critiques remind us that Foucault's work is not a final word but an invitation to debate, a provocation that spurs further inquiry. Conclusion? Madness and Civilization remains one of Michel Foucault's most influential works, not only for its historical narrative but for the conceptual questions it raises about reason, power, and the politics of knowledge. By showing how madness was alternately celebrated, confined, medicalized, and silenced, Foucault exposes the contingent foundations of what we take to be rational. Its relevance today is undeniable. In a world where psychiatric categories multiply, where mental illness remains stigmatized, and where institutions continue to discipline and normalize behavior, Foucault challenges us to ask, who decides what is normal, and at what cost? His book is not only about the past but about the structures that continue to shape our present. It urges us to listen to the voices excluded by dominant discourses and to question the systems that define our reality. If you found this exploration insightful and want to dive deeper into the ideas of great thinkers, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future discussions on philosophy, history, and society.